I'm really happy to welcome tonight's speaker, York Rowan. York is really the spearhead of our efforts to resume Oriental Institute fieldwork in the southern Levant, in Israel, and in Jordan after really far too long a hiatus. And York, in his position as a research associate here, has been playing an extremely important role in bringing our research back to that traditionally important area. Those of you who've been in our exhibit next door about James Henry Breaston and the founding of the Oriental Institute, you'll know that an interest in the archaeology of Palestine, the Holy Land, has been at the heart of what the Oriental Institute has done since its inception, and particularly with our work at Megiddo. And of course, Megiddo goes all the way back into the Neolithic period. York Rowan has focused his research on one of those very interesting and poorly known blank spots on the chronological map, and that is the Chalcolithic period. The Chalcolithic is a funny kind of period, the 5th millennium BC, in that it sort of falls betwixt and between sort of the real deep prehistory of looking at the Neolithic period and the beginnings of domestication of agriculture on the one hand, and then on the other side of the Chalcolithic is this time of the early Bronze Age and the beginnings of urbanism and of cities, towns in that region. And the Chalcolithic has traditionally been an area that people just haven't known a lot about. And that's exactly where we should be looking, is to fill in those blank spots on the map. That's one of the parts of our institutional mission. York has a very long history of research in that area. He received his BA from the University of Virginia in anthropology and his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, also in anthropology in 1998. He's taught at UT Austin. He's taught at Pennsylvania State University, Catholic University, American University, Notre Dame, before assuming his current position here at the Oriental Institute, where he is heading our Galilean prehistory project. York is also focused on artifact classes that, again, tend to get orphaned and yet have tremendous value. So many archaeologists, when they dig up ground stone, they say, oh God, and put it in the storehouse. But in fact, York has been able to show through his own work and through pulling together the work of others that ground stone artifacts actually give you tremendous insights into the economic life of ancient communities. York has gained increasing international recognition on his expertise in the late Chalcolithic, and most recently he's published a 92-page synthetic overview all about the Chalcolithic period in the southern Levant. So really what we are hearing about the Chalcolithic from the guy who actually is the go-to person on it, or has become the go-to person on this important period. As head of the Galilean Prehistory Project, York is undertaking a long-term 10-year research program which really aims at understanding the Chalcolithic period in the richest, most fertile part of the southern Levant in the Galilee. And he's doing it through a series of excavations, and part of his talk tonight is he's going to introduce us to his new excavations, which are the newest excavation of the Oriental Institute at March Rabbah. But what's so interesting is placing this work within the broader context of this enigmatic Chalcolithic society. What was their life like? What was their society like? What was their economy like? And what was their religious organization like? And that's the focus of this talk tonight. Its title is Death's Dominion, Chalcolithic Religion and Ritual Economy in the Southern Levant. So please join me in welcoming Dr. York Rowan.
Well, thank you very much, Gil, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Maeve. And thank all of you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. It's really nice to have the opportunity to talk about this rather obscure period in a little, not particularly well-known region. And so in that vein, I'd like to first introduce you to the Chalcolithic a little bit, because I know that most people really don't know much about it, if anything at all. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a background. It's actually a very swift run-through. And of course, I do have something of an agenda of trying to introduce you to what I think is really good evidence for religious ritual practice that I think really fostered a lot of the intensive craft production that I'll show you some examples of tonight. And then I'm going to sort of switch gears after I've tried to introduce you to this aspect of the Chalcolithic, to just show you a little bit, just give you a little taste of our most recent inaugural excavations at the site of Marj Rabbah in the Lower Galilee of northern Israel. And so let me get myself organized here, and perhaps we can move away from the rather gloomy... Can you still hear me when I move away from the microphone? Can people hear me in the back? Yes? It's good. Okay, thanks. Well, so we can move away from the gloomy picture that we have and just introduce you to the first site that was found when the Pontifical Biblical Institute initiated a search for Sodom and Gomorrah near the Dead Sea in the 1930s. They instead found the first site later to be recognized as the Chalcolithic site. The Chalcolithic is also in this region known as the Ghassulian, after this site, obviously. That's the sort of the type site for the period. And at first, some people didn't even really believe that this site they really didn't know where to place it. It didn't really look like it was Bronze Age, but there were some copper implements found. So initially, Alexis Malone, a father from the Pontifical Biblical Institute, did think that it was Bronze Age. And it sort of didn't fit anybody's scheme in the 30s. But it was clear that something very sophisticated was going on. And so you're, of course, looking at the site of Teleilat al-Ghassul near the Dead Sea in modern-day Jordan now, just one part of the plan of the village. So they excavated, the site is still currently being excavated by an Australian team, but they excavated about 10 years through the Pontifical Biblical Institute. So that it's a site with 11 different little hillocks. And so it's a very large site, very rich. And one of the remarkable things that was found at the site of Teleilat al-Ghassul were wall paintings. And this is just one of the wall paintings that was found from Ghassul. This is called the procession, and you can see a series of figures, one of them holding something that looks like a sickle, a crook, I don't know exactly what it is, and they look like they're probably wearing masks. So something very unusual was going on at this site that really didn't fit in anybody's understanding of the periodization as it was known at the time. Much better known is, this is from the front piece of the first publication by the Pontifical Biblical Institute, the wall painting known as the Star Wall painting from Teleilat al-Ghassul. Clearly, something symbolic is being represented here. The Chalcolithic people certainly could create portrayals, accurate representations of the animals and themselves when they wanted to. And so the representations of animals such as this, perhaps an ibex with those nice curved horns, other animals that the fathers suggested might be a bird, and others that I have no idea what that's supposed to be, with the whiskers. These are not intended to be direct representations of animals. Whatever they were planning to do, it was not intended to just be a straightforward representation. Well, as Gil mentioned already, the Chalcolithic chronology fits in between this period of the Neolithic, when early agricultural villages were created, where domesticated plants and animal first started, and sometime before the early Bronze Age. And so this, again, is a period that was not necessarily going to fit in a lot of people's schemes. What was apparent from Ghassul and sites that were excavated soon after was the sort of wealth of craft production that takes off during this intensive expansion. There's an expansion in population, in terms of villages reaching out into previously unoccupied areas or sparsely occupied areas, and larger villages. And along with it, a much more intensive craft production. And so we see not only finer pottery, there we go, different types of pottery, but even pottery with specific functions, such as the churn here, meant for the secondary products revolution, for converting milk into yogurt and cheese. Other artifact types, such as these are basalt bowls. It's actually not the greatest picture because you can see that there's a scale down there. And so in fact, these are nearly 1/2 meter across. These are solid basalt. These are basalt bowls carved out of lava, very hard material, and made with stone tools. They had copper tools, which would have been utterly useless against a basalt boulder. And so there's a very intensive labor being put into creating these types of hard stone bowls from a material not locally available at most of the sites where they're found. Other objects, ivory that's probably coming from hippopotamus in the Nile, and of course copper, for which the Chalcolithic, chalco being copper, takes its name. The copper smelting at this time is incredibly sophisticated. It's more sophisticated than anything we know being performed in any of the nearby regions, more so than any of the copper production in pre-dynastic Egypt and other neighboring regions. Now, of course, these are corroded versions, just have the sort of the dirt brushed off of them. We'll see a few other examples of copper items that are really quite remarkable. This is made in the lost wax casting method, and this indicates that there's an ability to access distant resources, mining, shipping it from distant areas, smelting it, and so the production of crafts is really vastly different in contrast to the earlier Neolithic period. Well, how do we understand this? What is the explanation for this, I shouldn't say explosion really, but sometimes it looks like that in contrast to the late pottery Neolithic? It's clear that there are new types of specialized architecture. There are some sites where we probably have dedicated ritual sites, call them sanctuaries, preferably not temples, but some sort of dedicated ritual center. We have underground, we have underground features, such as these subterranean tunnels that join subterranean rooms. And we have new mortuary practices that are diverse, so that not everybody's being buried the same way. We have people who are being buried in the standard way that Neolithic people were buried, just in a simple pit and articulated burial. We have other more diverse ways, so that we see where there are secondary burials. The people would return to their loved ones' corpse after all the flesh is gone, pick out some bones, and have secondary treatment, secondary burial. And those would sometimes go in these ossuaries. This is a ceramic ossuary for the container, a container for the bones, for reburial. Sometimes reburial in cemeteries, which are also another new item of the Chalcolithic. So we have all of these different shifting patterns that suggest that something rather dramatic has occurred during the period. All of this put together has suggested to some scholars that what's going on is that we have non-egalitarian societies, that we now have some sort of hierarchical ranked society, that there are now elites who have inherited their power, who have inherited prestige and status. And this is an idea with new wealth items being found in Chalcolithic sites that's started to take off a bit. And I actually would like to argue, not the opposite tonight, but to suggest a different interpretation. And what I'd like to suggest to you tonight is that much of this is a period of ritual intensification that was not determined by elite individuals, but in fact was determined by the needs of ritual practices that have really taken off during this period. The need to have a variety of different objects for ritual practice, much of it for mortuary practices. And so that's what I'd like to introduce you to this evening. After the site of Teleilat al-Ghassul, there wasn't really a great deal of excavation until the 50s, after the formation of the State of Israel, after things calmed down a bit. And one of the early discoveries was the site of Nahal Mishmar. Now, of course, some of the scholars in the room are well acquainted with this site. It's a pretty well-known deposit for the southern Levant, for Palestine, Israel, Jordan. But it was quite a remarkable find, and it was part and parcel of a new push by the Israeli archaeologists to look for more scrolls along the Dead Sea. And I've put down a little map so that you can locate some of these sites, so just a little insert. And this is where the Nahal Mishmar cave is found, just in a wadi, just near the Dead Sea. And here you have a jeep for scale, looking like it must have been dropped off by a helicopter or something. I have no idea how they got it up there. And here you find the cave entrance in a sheer cave face. And what they found there was quite remarkable, because they found a hoard of objects from the Chalcolithic secreted away in this cave inside of a mat. This is part of the mat right there. That has recently been redated using AMS dates. And so now we are quite certain that it is the Chalcolithic. The AMS dates actually made it a little bit earlier, so there's no doubt now that it is not early bronze. It is the Chalcolithic, solidly Chalcolithic. Of course, the state of preservation is remarkable. You have a mat there from 6,000 years ago still preserved, and there were other sandals and so on preserved in the cave as well. So cleaned up, the collection was amazing. Over 400 copper objects, many of them in pretty good nick. I think we can agree that for things that are 6,000 years old and stuck in a cave in an old mat are doing pretty well once they've been cleaned up properly by the conservators. This is not like many other hoards that have really been found. And so this is a pretty well-known array of objects. But you'll notice that there are not only a large proportion of them are these mace heads, or more elaborate mace heads, sometimes called standards, or these, sometimes called scepters. But really, it's an elaborate mace head with more of a shaft. And these are made, again, in this lost wax casting method, very often with complex metals. That is that there's a higher content of arsenic and antimony in the copper. And so this enables it to give it a much brighter shine and a harder copper. You'll notice, let's see, I don't think there's actually any tools in this. There were some things that look like axes and adzes. Probably wouldn't have survived very well as tools. They were probably a bit soft. And of course, I'll just highlight a few of these vessels. We'll see ceramic analogs of those vessels a bit later on this evening. So that's the hoard, a few more objects from the hoard. You can see some of the favorite motifs, and I point them out because they are patterned. They are recurring motifs that we see in other objects, very often in mortuary contexts, such as the horns, which keep showing up, and birds, the bird motifs. There was some ivory found, not very much. I think there were 6 objects that look like this in the Nahal Mishmar hoard, and just one object like this, this box. Again, these are hippopotamus ivory, and long thought to be absolutely from the Nile. There was recently the discovery of a small hippopotamus skeleton along the coast of Israel in a Chalcolithic context. So I've always asserted that they must come from the Nile. Now we have to wonder if possibly it is true that there was some hippopotamus living in the marshes along the coast of modern-day Israel. Be that as it may, it's an exotic material that's finding its way primarily into mortuary contexts. So after a number of settlement sites have been excavated, many of them in the Negev, and this is one of the ones that I've worked on for a number of years. This is in the early days of the excavation, and the site of Shikmim is one of the largest Chalcolithic site in western Palestine. You can see it located right here. Here's the village in early excavations, our camp, before we learned that it's much better to have it up on the hill to keep the mosquitoes away, and the Wadi Beersheba along here. Just a plan of part of the village, not the entire village. Again, you can see where Shikmim is down here, Nahal Mishmar was over there. And just a plan of the village. You can see these are foundations of walls. You can see courtyards, smaller rooms, larger rooms, even little storage areas. And you'll also notice something rather peculiar, and this is sort of in the upper terrace of the site. And these are where these subterranean features were dug into the sediments, just into the soil of the upper village, and deep into it. And so you have underground rooms connected with underground tunnels. And the question has been, why? Why would somebody put so much work into digging these underground chambers, which in fact are quite dangerous, we discovered, in trying to excavate them. You can see behind here that this is the light shining in, and it's because we've removed the roof in the back. We couldn't excavate underground in most cases. It's too dangerous. Once the sediment starts to dry out, it collapses. And so it seems unlikely that people were living underground here, as was originally suggested by the eminent French prehistorian Jean Perrot. He thought that they were adaptations to the hot desert environment. It seems more likely that they were probably being used perhaps for storage. There are pits, bell-shaped pits in the underground floors of the chambers. But it also seems clear that they were being used for burial. And I'm suggesting that some of these were used for the initial interment of people, and that later bones were retrieved and then reburied in the cemetery nearby. In the subterranean chambers, there's actually not that many artifacts. It's not that rich. There are entire chambers where you just find a few pieces of pottery, and it almost looks like it's been cleaned out. But in other areas, there are some nice finds, and almost all of the ivory from the Beersheba sites were found in the subterranean chambers. And I do feel like some of these sort of hark to possible Egyptian similarities, but I don't really know that the Egyptologists would agree with me on that. But I bring this up because there are these different forms of burial going on in the Chalcolithic. So we have an articulated human buried in a pit, very much like you would find in the Neolithic. At the same time, you have some of these burials where you're having bones retrieved and they're being reburied. At Shikmin, they're being reburied apparently at the nearby cemeteries. There's a series of at least 6, possibly 7 cemeteries on these hills. So the site is down below here. And then up on the hills are these grave circles. So this is really the first occasion for separated formal cemeteries where the dead are really buried away outside, extramural from the village. And you have shallow grave circles, and this is what a grave circle that's just been swept off would look like. You can understand from this why it's an incredibly difficult thing to interpret, why it's difficult to excavate, and it's very difficult to come up with demographic estimations. You have individuals mixed together in these grave circles, sometimes with finds, so that in some cases there are a few finds, such as this stone pallet on the floor of one of these grave circles. Now, they probably had a superstructure on top of that stone, but as you saw, it was exposed on a hill, so it's probably eroded away. Either it was made of mud brick and then eroded away, or the stones have been knocked away and taken away. Some of them were actually looted. What's also interesting is to wonder exactly how we can interpret what an object like that, who that was found with. And so the problem with coming up with a scheme for hierarchical elites is that we don't have burials like we have the luxury of knowing about in Egypt, where you have single burial with either just a few pots or a lot of pots or pots, pallets, and other objects to be able to then start understanding a status, a hierarchical ranking. We don't have that luxury. We have secondary burials mixed together with some nice objects, as I'll show you, but no way to really separate out who has a higher status, if they did. I just threw this in because this is a recent discovery, recent being 2005, but for archaeologists and how long it takes us to publish things, that's very recent. This is a recent, most of these cemeteries that I will show you, aside from the one at Shikmin, are often found in development. So it's contract archaeology, similar to what goes on in this country. And this is one of those. This is at the site of Palmahim, coastal site, a coastal cemetery. And here you can see maybe a vague similarity in a grave circle, but rather than just putting the long bones and crania of secondary burials in the grave circle, they've actually put them in ossuaries. And so here we have these large tub stone ossuaries. In the stone ossuaries, very often they combined different individuals. So you'll find a series of femurs right next to femurs and crania next to crania, all put together in the stone ossuary. Some suggestions have been made that perhaps these are similar, a sort of similar arid region type of burial to the Nawamis, several Nawamis fields in Sinai. I'm not so sure that that is really accurate. These seem to possibly date a little bit later, maybe to the early Bronze one. And these are all, as far as I know, they're all articulated burials, so they're not secondary burials like the grave circles. Obviously, they're circular and well-made, but beyond that, the similarities are not entirely convincing. Well, what the Chalcolithic period is really known for, and I had mentioned earlier that there are diverse burial patterns. I did that on purpose because everybody thinks of the Chalcolithic as this type of burial, secondary burials that go inside of ossuaries and then are placed inside of caves. And there are quite a number of them, and some of them are the richest burials that we've found. So for instance, this is the Picayune cave. This is in the very north of modern-day Israel, very near the border of Lebanon. And you can see what you're looking at is a ceramic ossuary. And this is the top, so it's upside down. It would have sat on top. And you can see the nose. This is very typical of the Ghassulian image. They often, almost all the ossuaries have a nose represented, very often a modeled big nose, and sometimes not much more. You can see the nice paint on the side. And you can see handles that would have sort of latched on the top. And of course, breasts. you're wondering, well, what is all the molten ice cream all over everything? It's a karstic cemetery, so of course you can even see the dripping. This is still an active karstic cave, and so you've got calcium carbonates dripping all over everything, solidifying. It's a horrible mess from what I understand, trying to chip the human bone out of this kind of concretion, as well as the artifacts, of course. This Picayune cave we'll return to in a bit. I just threw together a map to demonstrate where the ossuaries are found. Ossuaries are generally found in caves, so the red stars indicate ossuaries that are found in caves. The Picayune cave site that we just looked at is way up here in the north. And a few other ossuaries are not found in caves. So for instance, one that we looked at, Shikmim, was from the grave circle, but it's very rare to find ossuaries. So you'll also notice, of course, that there's this cluster of a whole series of caves, primarily ossuaries in caves. And of course, this cluster is because most of these caves are found during development. They're found at the edge of the bulldozer's blade, unfortunately. And then rescue archaeology is conducted, and they try to salvage as much as they can. Why the heavy concentration there? Of course, because that's where Tel Aviv and the outlying suburbs are, and this is where the majority of development has been taking place. In fact, my colleague Jamie Lovell has been working in Jordan, and she did 2 surveys recently looking at caves in this area and caves down in this area. Because it's very odd, you'll notice that there's sort of this line right up along here, and to the east there's no more ossuaries, and there's no more ossuaries in caves. So she did a survey in these 2 areas, looking in caves, wherever she could find them, methodically, and found no ossuaries and found no Chalcolithic burials. Pretty remarkable. So it does seem like this is probably also a cultural pattern, that there is something going on the west side of the Jordan Valley that's intentional. There is actually a typology of ossuaries. This was put together by Jean Perrault and his colleague Daniel Laderet in the 1980s. And you can see the stone tub type of ossuary we saw an example of already. The so-called house ossuaries, I prefer to use the term structural ossuaries. The idea originally was that these probably could be interpreted to represent what Chalcolithic houses look like. And I think that's probably a pretty good example of a European, Western point of view as to what houses might look like. It's kind of unlikely that Near Eastern houses would have had a peaked roof like this, unless the Tudors appeared a lot earlier than we thought. And then, of course, there are jar ossuaries. And here are a couple of jar ossuaries. Now, this is also a remarkable site, Kisufim. Kisufim is very south, the coastal plain. And what you're looking at is an artist, well, actually the excavator's artistic reconstruction of the site. Again, it was discovered by a bulldozer right on the edge of Gaza, just inside of Israel. Kisufim is a large rectangular structure of mud brick, underground, entirely subterranean, and with all of these different offerings. So you see a structural ossuary, you see these jar ossuaries, we're back here, you see pottery associated with the structural ossuary, and even these big pots were also ossuaries. There's no entrance, there's no door, there are a few niches, there's no windows, so they assumed that there was some sort of entrance from the top, or possibly it was all done at once and never re-entered. And let's see, there's probably something else I wanted to say about Kisufim. It is interesting that it's very close down on the coast, very close to Egypt, so I have this temptation to say that it looks like something early Egyptian, but I've been assured that that is not a mastaba. It's not really related to a mastaba, but it is a curious feature. It's the only one like it in Palestine, Israel. And so it is a subterranean burial, but it doesn't actually have a cave. They created their own cave. Well, just here's a simple distribution map of where these different sites. This is Kisufim that we just looked at down here, Shikmim with the grave circles, Nahal Mishmar, and over here Teleilat al-Ghassul. As you can see, the karstic caves tend to be more inland, and along the coast you have sort of caverns, hollows in the chalk, in the Kirkar, that are old beach, fossilized beach. So they'll have cavities that people would then hollow out, enlarge, and then put burials inside there. So if they didn't have karstic caves, they would make a cave and then put their ossuaries in there. Nahal Kana is one of the few caves that we have that was not discovered with a bulldozer. It was discovered by spelunkers who were diving into caves. This is actually, you can see from its location, it's actually in the West Bank or in the Palestinian Autonomous Zone now. And so you can see that it's a very deep cave system, over 20 meters straight down, with a number of different chambers, some of them named, of course, the copper room. It even had a Neolithic use at one point, without burials as far as we know, but with pots and so on. Probably not people living in there. Again, it was a karstic cave, so it would have been probably pretty damp and unpleasant and deep. One of the more remarkable finds from Nahal Kana was striking. You'll see that there are these gold and electrum ringlets, circlets, they've also been called ingots, were found in this little passage area over here. And so you're looking at, these are my little representations of ossuaries, and these are where the human finds were found. Very often the human finds are not still in the ossuaries because they're broken. Something's collapsed on them, they've been kicked over, people have come back. So we have a very hard time being able to work out who gets buried in an ossuary. Is more than one person buried in an ossuary? We have a lot of problems trying to sort this out. The gold was the first gold that's been found from the Chalcolithic period, and as far as I know, it's still not been sourced. From what I understand, gold is very difficult to source. But the most likely, the closest possibilities are Azerbaijan and Nubia. Nubia being closer and with some possible connections between the southern Levant and the Nile, Nubia seems the more likely source, but we really haven't been able to trace it precisely. I've seen wall painting depictions from Egyptian wall paintings that have sort of gold ingots that look very similar, but these are vastly later. So there's something very odd going on here. What it is not exactly clear. Other mortuary finds, I mean, we've seen now the ossuaries, we've seen the copper, we've seen some basalt bowls, but this is a particularly elaborate example of a basalt bowl that stands about that high. Keep in mind, not only is this a very hard volcanic rock to work, but that this is an elaborately created object, all of one piece, made with stone tools somehow. I think the somehow means many, many evenings sitting around grinding down with other pieces of basalt or scoria. How long it would have taken, I really don't know, probably weeks, if not longer. So you can see that all these connections of this square basalt bowl, even the little pierced handles, are all made out of a solid basalt boulder originally that is not found locally at the site. There's no basalt down on the coastal plain. Now, the next site that I will show you really deserves its own lecture, but it's not going to get one this evening. Gilad is a particularly interesting site because the excavators believe and have argued and recently published the final project, the final publication from Gilad, and have argued that this site is a sanctuary site, a site of pilgrimage, that people were coming from all sorts of different regions, bringing different objects as offerings or something to the site and leaving them in deposits. The site is particularly well known for, of course, the zoomorphic figurine of the ram with cornets and the anthropomorphic figurine, the so-called Gilad lady. And you can, of course, imagine how archaeologists wax poetical when this kind of imagery is offered, with the churn on top of her head that inspires notions of fertility, fecundity, and the importance of the flocks. You can also imagine that many archaeologists have argued that she's pregnant, which personally I don't really believe that's the case. And of course, if you believe she's pregnant, then she's probably sitting on a birthing stool. You can let your imagination run wild with this. But they are intriguing objects, and they were thought to have been found in one sort of central deposit of Gilad. But in fact, Gilad itself, as a site, as architecture, is not particularly inspiring. Here you see our excavations. I believe this is 1992, the last season. You can see a mud brick building with maybe a stone platform, some hearths, but what you really notice is that there's a lot of holes all over the site, pits all over the place. And the excavators who published the site, who I worked with for a number of years, suggested that this is a pilgrimage site, and I believe that they're right, that it is some sort of centralized, ritualized site. But what they didn't emphasize is that there were a lot of people buried here. So by the physical anthropologist's estimation, about 91 people were buried at the site. And so I'm suggesting that there's an association of mortuary ritual with the site, that's probably one of the important functions of this centralized ritual place. And that's partially because of not only the humans that are there, but the objects that are found in those pits. Now, unfortunately, again, these are not directly associated. These are not nice, straightforward burial with object directly next to it so that you can say this object belongs to that person. I think the general site was a mortuary site where we find pallets of materials that are not local to the site. So scoria is a volcanic material from the far north, the Golan or the Galilee. Granite pallets that are found probably from either Sinai or the southern Negev, southern Jordan. Obsidian, very few pieces, but other than one piece from Ghassul, I think that these are the only obsidian blades from the Chalcolithic in the southern Levant at all. And we use neutron activation analysis and trace them back to 3 different sources in Anatolia, a good, I think, 1,000 kilometers away or something, so quite some distance. And of course, some beautiful mace heads that are made out of different materials, hematite on either side here, granite, and chrysocolla, so a copper-based type of material from somewhere in the Negev, southern Jordan, granite also from down around those areas, and hematite either from central Jordan or the southern Negev. And here I'd like to point out that I think that one of the things that we tend not to always think of, but I think it's important to remember, is that these materials, if they're not local at the site, if they're not locally available, this is a material that might inspire sort of the pieces of a place, I think that Richard Bradley called it. Something that is particularly symbolic or inviting to the owner or to the user or the person who deposits it, because it's a material of a long distance, a foreign place, something exotic that's not locally available. Also from the site of Gilad, the violin-shaped figurines. The figurines are almost all are made of stone. All the ones from Gilad, I think, are made of stone. You can see why people would suggest that it was a schematic representation of the female form, which was, of course, also derided for some time until there came a few examples with maybe a bit better evidence to support that idea. Again, these are not made of local materials for the most part. This is granite, again, far south or from Sinai. Even the limestone, which is all this is not a local limestone. It's coming from somewhere else. Now, not all of these have been sourced. They've not all been petrographically determined exactly where they came from, but we know that they're not available locally. I should mention that the violin-shaped figurines, there are 73 fragments just from the site of Gilad, which doesn't really sound like a lot, probably. But in fact, that's an estimate of maybe in the upper 60s, if maybe a few of them came from the same one. If you take all of the violin-shaped figurines found in Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, put them together, there's not as many from all the other sites as there are just from this one site. So it does seem like these things are coming from different areas and being deposited at the site. And then I just couldn't resist throwing this in, a different type of mortuary process going on, the burial of a dog. And this was, according to Carolyn Grigson, an archaeozoologist who's worked on the material and, for many years and published it. You have a complete dog, an elderly dog, a dog who had a hard time, a bit of a hard life, had a broken radius, a left radius, that never really healed, and yet the dog survived to an old age, to actually be buried in his own area with his own vessel. I'm looking for any other examples in the Near East of an animal that is buried with its own mortuary vessel as early as this. I don't know of any other examples. We certainly know of dogs who are buried with humans from the Natufian, but we don't know, I don't know of any that are buried with their own object as their own mortuary offering or mortuary item. Okay, so these are just some of the different Chalcolithic sites, and one of the things that you'll notice is that most of the sites that I've been talking about have been down in the south. There's a number of reasons for that. The sites are big, the sites are well preserved, the sites are not impacted by modern development, they don't have tells on top of them. So they're marvelous sites and places to work for just the period. But what you'll also notice is that up in the north, there's sort of a big gap. There are no settlements. Now, we know that there are Chalcolithic sites up there. We have survey examples of material that's Chalcolithic. And there have been small salvage excavations where somebody's putting in a new radio tower or a new piece of road. So there have been small glimpses, but we don't really have any example of an architectural plan or radiocarbon dates from any settlements of Chalcolithic in the north. We do, however, have the site of Picayune in the north. And this is that cave burial that you saw that I showed you earlier. And again, this is up in the very north, very near the Lebanon border. And Pekin introduced something that we'd never really seen before. We knew about secondary burials in Chalcolithic ossuaries. We knew that the ossuaries would be painted very often with a big nose modeled on it, but we'd never seen anything with faces as extraordinary as this, the one that I call the Pekin scream. It's got a mouth. The mouth was, I think, unknown from any of the ossuaries discovered before this. And even more remarkable was this sort of creature, person, I'm not sure. The arms look pretty human, but it's got a snout, as somebody said earlier today, something that looks like a raccoon. It's not clear what he's got on his head either, on the sides. They're in the right place maybe for ears, but it looks more like an old pilot's headgear or something. So a whole new variety of motifs and elements were introduced with these ossuaries that we'd not seen before at any of these other burial sites. Modeled heads, not just with a nose, but with eyes and with ears and with possible headdresses or braids. Pots with breasts and nose on that are used as ossuaries. That's not actually an ossuary. It's a very tall stand with bowls on top of it and faces, of course. This one I think of as the Kilroy was here ossuary, but it's obviously a female. And even sort of the creepy twin ossuary. So there's this amazing diversity. What I'm showing you is only a small portion because there were hundreds of ossuaries found in the cave, and they're not published yet. There's an estimate of perhaps as many as 600 individuals buried in the Pekin cave. If that's accurate, well, actually, even if that's not accurate, this is the largest sample of a human population from the Chalcolithic by far. So this is really quite a remarkable cave. Well, what I've talked about so far, and I want to just sort of rehash or just touch upon this one final time, is that we've got these social valuables moving around the landscape. And what I'm suggesting is that although these are clearly prestige objects, we don't have the clear association that, that there are individual elites using these types of events as aggrandizing affairs to basically to improve their status or to show off their status. Instead, I would argue that we have a period of ritual intensification whereby people, perhaps as a ritual mode of production during seasonal times, are offering and reburying secondary burial processes and putting these types of objects in with the burials. So rather than seeing it as an individual sort of political move, I would rather see it as something that is motivated by ritual need, by a ritual process, and the need to have the right kinds of objects as part of that ritual process. And these are just some of the objects that we find most frequently associated with the mortuary sites. Well, I did promise that I wanted to turn to our recent excavations, and so it might seem like a bit of a disconnect, but in fact, there's Pekin up there, this wonderful cave site up in the north. And we did look around at the possibility of excavating right outside. We suspect there's a village outside of the cave site, but right now there's a modern village as well, so it's a difficult place to excavate. And so as part of an effort to understand where are these people coming from who are buried at Pekin, 600 people, are they coming from the local settlement? Is it only one village that lived nearby that buried their dead there for a long period of time? Or are people coming from a variety of different Chalcolithic villages? Or are they coming from great distances to be buried at Pekin or to bury their loved ones at Pekin? We have ossuaries that have motifs that we recognize from the south. We have copper implements at Pekin that were never known from anywhere except for in the south. An ivory head, again, the type of object that was only found at southern Chalcolithic sites. So it suggests connections from great distances are exemplified by the deposit at Pekin. So we wanted to start looking at other sites and start getting a sample of sites in the north. And so we're starting with the site of Marj Rabba, a name that we found from the early PEF, Palestine Exploration Fund, maps of the region. And you can see it's nearby the famous site of Yodfat and an Arab village in Lower Galilee by the name of Sakhnin. Here's the site when we visited in December on just a lovely, perfect day to go out and do a little bit of mapping. We had to make a schematic map to apply for a license. And so you'll see this is Jay Rosenberg, who volunteered his time to come up and use his total station to help us put together a map. And Dina Shalem, who worked at the Pekin site when they excavated it, and Dina Shalem's buddy, Mocha, and my co-director, Morag Kersel. How did we know there was a site there? Simply by the objects on the surface. We had no traces of architecture on the surface, so it was a bit nerve-wracking to start excavating a site where it's an agricultural area. We didn't know if there was anything left subsurface. We certainly had good evidence for a Chalcolithic site by the sherds. The groundstone, not such good evidence. That could come from a lot of different periods. And so we decided we would excavate in this area. These are olive groves. They're privately owned, and so we didn't really want to deal with trying to dig between people's olive trees and what they might expect to charge us and the possibility of damaging anybody's olive trees. This land is owned by the Jewish National Fund, and so is this replanted forested area. So these are the two areas that we excavated, and we'll just look at them very briefly. I just wanted to show you sort of the highlights of a very brief season. Unfortunately, you saw that very nice green pasturage that we were at in December. By the time we returned in July, everything had grown up dramatically, and so we have thistles that were about my height in places, and it was pretty miserable trying to hike around in there and lay out grid, put up squares and so on. We did hire a guy who said he could borrow a weed whacker, and that lasted an hour and a half before the weed whacker was fini. And so then we talked to Ali, who was more than willing to bring in, the big guns, his goats, and did a marvelous job. He said, well, why didn't you tell me sooner? I could have had the whole area cleared. It wasn't his land, and so he didn't bring his animals onto the land because he didn't feel he should. As soon as he found out it was fine by us and no one else cared, in came the goats and the cattle as well, and so we were very soon in business. Of course, we did have to watch out that we didn't step in the business, but nevertheless, they did a wonderful job, and we really appreciated their help, and so we started to lay out a grid. This is, of course, in this strip of land that you saw before, and here are the planted forests just on the other side of the fence. We started whacking away in good biblical fashion with our picks, and we quickly had to stop that because you can see even as shallow as it is, and this was very hard, very compact land, and so the picks really were necessary to get the ball rolling. We also found architecture very quickly, and so we didn't have to go very deep before we had substantial wall foundations, stone wall foundations, and features starting to show up. Features that look like probably silos or some sort of storage bin, fragmentary preserved floors, and again, sort of the corner of a wall. Just a close-up of the silo. The silo was actually excavated by a graduate student at the University of Chicago, so she has very good pictures of herself sitting in the silo. Taken from another angle, you can see the corner of the wall extending over into the other square, and that's the other square, so you have this wall continuing like so. So far it looks like we have a nice building, stone foundation, probably continuing into this square where we're very, very excited about continuing next year, not only because we hope we'll get the back wall and get a full exposure of one building. This would be wonderful. I mean, we really sort of hit the goal the first season to find this kind of architecture right off, and also to investigate this rather intriguing circular stone feature as well as some of these other stone features. This is particularly intriguing. And it also is to the credit of a graduate student who really sort of started excavating very carefully with a trowel, and this would have been very easy for us to blow through all of these little cobbles with a pick. It was only through good, careful, sort of prehistoric excavating with a trowel that we were able to recognize that we had some features there. And we found lots of pottery, some flint, not as much as I would like. Very good assemblage of faunal remains. Some of the painted wares that are typical of the North, from what little we know. Even some wares that are probably non-local. This is called hula ware from sort of the Hula Basin north of the Sea of Galilee. It doesn't mean that it necessarily came from there. The decoration, though, is typical of wares that have been found like that. So, of course, we'll need to do some petrography to investigate where this really was found. More exciting for me than the pottery is the flint. These types of flint objects, I don't know of them from the south. We don't find them in the southern Negev sites that I'm used to working on. But completed, it would have looked a lot like this object. So it's a flaked disc, flaked very thin, maybe 2 centimeters thick maximum, bifacially flaked, and then drilled through the center. These are found in the Golan sites and in the Jordan Valley. Now, whether or not it's an import to this site or whether or not this is just how far that type of artifact extended, we don't really know at this point, but it's very exciting to find something like that. Possible spindle whorl, loom weight, a little bone pendant fragment. You can see it's quite small. That's about 1 centimeter there, so it's fragmented on this end, but it's only about 1/2 centimeter wide, beautifully polished. And then that was all from this area that we excavated in those few squares. The other area, what you can see peeking through these trees are large stone mounds. And those large stone mounds were intriguing to us. What are they? Why are they such huge piles of stone? Is it ritual? Is there a burial site buried under there? Is there a temple? Or is it just a pile of rocks that somebody put there from field clearance? We really didn't know, and so there were several of them, as you saw from that map. We chose the one that actually had some architecture on it, a wall visible from the surface, for our first investigation. We excavated a trench on either side of that wall, and then we also put in a square on the other end of the wall where we thought there might be a corner with another wall. Now you can already see in this section, as well as these sections, it's not fun digging. We thought maybe there'll be a layer of rock on top of a nice earthen mound that'll have some burials under it or something. Not a chance. Solid rock all the way down. Solid rock, so we had to dig with a pick. Here you see Brittany Jackson, a former University of Chicago student, recently graduated, and Stephanie Sellover, a graduate student here at UC, picking away. And actually, she did actually work a lot. It's not that she spent all of her time advising, but in fact, it was really hard work, and you had to take turns whacking at the rocks with the pick. Well, this is what our excavations looked like in that trench. And you can see that it's stone all the way down on either side until you reach bedrock, more stone. And so, in short, did we answer our questions? Is this Chalcolithic? No. We really do not know. We found Chalcolithic sherds in amongst these rocks, and we found a few little Roman sherds in amongst these rocks. So we really cannot date it. We have a very nice wall, but all the way down here we are getting only Chalcolithic sherds, but that doesn't really help us date this wall up here. We found nothing else except for a few sherds, a few pieces of basalt grinders. And so in the end, we didn't know what those large stone mounds were there for, or whether or not they're Chalcolithic. Now, of course, we had Israeli colleagues, archaeologists, field archaeologists, dropping by quite frequently, and we welcome all comers. But nevertheless, we got different views of what it was. So one fellow who I like dearly said, "I can feel it. It feels Chalcolithic." Okay, he's an Iron Age specialist. I'm glad to hear it, but others weren't so sure and suggested that they might be sort of Byzantine structures. But nobody came and said, you fools, this is an Iron Age something. So we are still lacking, and I don't know that we're going to spend a lot more time digging through rock. Again, you can see the profile. There was a lot of community interest while we dug, so we had visitors who came and visited us of all ages, including some very small ones, visiting the site. And we had volunteers who were quite willing to pitch in. These are a couple of boys from the local area whose mother seemed very eager to get them out of the house during the summer and have them volunteer their help. She drove away pretty quickly. But they were a lot of fun to have around. We actually were overwhelmed with people who were willing to volunteer their time on the site, but we hadn't really planned for that. And you do want people who are going to come back more than one day, so they have some experience, gain some experience, and you can kind of keep control over things. We did have 1 or 2 days where we didn't sort of like the direction things were going as people came ready to hop right in the pit. So this is our crew from the excavation at the end of the season, still smiling, amazingly enough. And so those are our first season's excavations at Marj Rabbah. And we're hoping to go back again this summer and dig a much larger area so that we can get a better architectural plan. What we desperately need, of course, are some carbonized material to get radiocarbon dates, because, again, we don't have any from any Chalcolithic site in the north except for Picayune. And, of course, that's a burial cave, so that's problematic in its own right. And so, sorry?
Where were you in the picture?
Let's see, am I there? I'm taking the picture. But I really was there, I promise. I think I had another picture, and probably I was making a bad face or something that was not very, very useful. And actually, I particularly like this one because these guys were smiling, and in the other picture they weren't smiling. They looked very, very unhappy, which really wasn't the case. They were great fun to work with. But so trying to get people all together smiling and looking like they still enjoy each other's company is pretty important. So I just wanted to thank you all again and take any questions or comments or suggestions. And thanks very much.